What's the worst news you've ever had to deliver and how did it go? Anesthesiologist here. I usually accompany the surgeon when explaining to the relatives that a patient had died. The worst has to be when an expectant pregnant mother came in with her husband for a cesarean section. The father was carrying a bag filled with baby stuff like clothes, a blanket, a knit cap, etc. The baby was dead when she came out. I was a front-end manager at a big box store. I came back from my lunch to see a coroner's van in the parking lot. My manager took me aside and explained my cashier's 16-year-old little brother had committed suicide by jumping in front of a train, and the coroner wanted help breaking the news to him. So I held his hands and told him myself, since I figured I was the only one there who was actually friends with the guy outside work. He collapsed and cried and screamed. I took him home to his girlfriend. The funeral was fucking awful. Kid was cremated and his urn was up on his skateboard. My friend was sobbing. The dad was in a dead faint half the time, permanently seared into my brain. Might not be bad news to some, but it was for the recipient. My ex-husband had a cat when we met. She was about a year old. She was around when our daughter was born and lived for 18 years. On the morning of our daughter's 16th birthday, I woke up early and crutched to the kitchen, had a broken foot at the time. As I get into the dining room, I noticed the cat lying on the floor, with her eyes open and vomit by her mouth. My first thought was, oh shit. I nudged her with a crutch to be sure. I had to go wake my ex and tell him his cat was dead. I have never seen someone so crushed. I felt like shit that I had to tell him. He sat on the floor, cradling her body and crying. Then our daughter woke up, saw what was going on and started crying too. Stimpy Up had been around my daughter's whole life. I was sad for the both of them. We put her in a garbage bag and into our chest freezer. We had her cremated inches in a little urn on his dresser. Every Christmas he puts her little stocking on it. I had to fire a couple people back in my manager days and it always sucked, even with cause. I had to tell my wife her mother passed away. While her mom had been in the hospital for a while and it was not exactly a surprise, it was still a terrible thing to tell her because there was still hope for her mom to recover. I got the call as I was the one taking care of the bills. My wife was sleeping. I had to wake her up and tell her. Horrible thing to do. I drove her to the hospital, and then she didn't want to get in, so it was painful as hell to convince her to come in to see her dead mom. There was a child who was touched inappropriately by a staff member at the elementary school I was working at. I had to call the mom and tell her what happened. She broke down in tears and didn't even know what to say. It was one of the most sad moments of my life. I still wonder if everything is okay with the kid when she grew up. Had to tell my mother, who was at the hospital battling through terminal cancer, that her husband, my dad, who was battling through a lung virus in another hospital at the same time, had died. She looked sad and said she had this feeling in her heart that he passed. Me and my brother waited to tell her, though didn't tell her right away. She was already going through the worst and we wanted her to have the strength to battle through it than delivering horrible news. Unfortunately, she didn't survive the battle herself either. My cousin confided in me that her husband had cheated on her, but told me they were on counseling, working on their relationship, and that he had cut ties and hadn't seen the mistress in 3 months. 2 days later, my husband saw her husband at the grocery store with his mistress, and I had to deliver the news to her. They ended getting a divorce after that. It really sucked all around. I've had to be the one to tell people someone they love died a few times in my life. It's hard, but you have to get it out clear and concise, probably just prefaced with like so sorry I have to tell you this. And then just let them cry, comfort them if they want it, grieve with them. I was always grieving them too. They weren't strangers, or leave them alone to process if they need it. I've had to read a cause of death to parents once the autopsy results were in. It was a very calm, poignant moment of processing for them. My nerves were obviously rattled. I had to tell my 3 kids that their mother had been found dead and committed suicide. It didn't go well. One of my daughters fainted and passed out while the other 2 children broke into hysterics. Not something I will ever forget. Also, I had a 90-mile drive to make to break the news. I had to tell my stepmom that she's not getting my dad's money or house the day he passed away, after she brought it up in the hospital. It did not go over well. Same as everyone else. My mom called me and told me that my grandma is dead and she couldn't make the phone calls to anyone else, so I had to do it. 20 calls. Calling my parents from abroad, telling them that their grandchild died during childbirth, and asked them if they could get on a plane to look after my son while I look after the mother, while being completely devastated myself. They were there the day after. My best friend, also a colleague, was on a training course. I called him after work to see how it had gone. There was no answer. I tried a few times afterwards, and then his GF called asking if ID heard from him. A short time later I got a call from an unknown number asking why ID been calling. It was the police and my mate had been in a serious RTA. They were after next of kin details, so I had to call his boss. GF and family. The only ones I didn't call were his mum and dad, as I didn't have the number, although I knew where they live, so described that to the police. He was taken off life support 3 days later. He genuinely was one of the best people. Everyone loved him and he had always been there for me. Words cannot place how different life is without him. Had to phone my mother at work to tell her my sister died in a car accident. Before I told her, I think it was the last time I heard actual happiness in her voice and the way she answered the phone. She has never been the same. Having to tell my dad they found a mass in my mom's torso. It happened last week. We know it's cancer. We still don't know what kind, what stage, if it's curable or terminal. But let's say it doesn't look good. They are both around 80 yo, married 55 years. My dad's answer after I told him was to tear up and say, if she dies before me, I'll go lay down on her grave and wait for my death like an old faithful dog. I cannot remember the last time I cried this much. Fuck, I'm still crying as I type this. Call my aunts to tell them that their brother has died that evening. Made it short and a clinical call. No time for too much emotions. It needed to be done. I had to tell my daughter that her grandfather died. Next to me, he was the guy for her. They loved each other so much. So she was 6 when he passed and had never experienced death, not even a goldfish, and her number 2 guy died. When my wife and I told her, she looked at us with tears in her eyes. All she said was why. That was the hardest thing I've had to do. Telling my right-wing religious dad I was gay. Folks, it is possible to watch someone's face visibly age several years upon hearing some unwanted news.